Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 179 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the second week of August 2025. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about Witkoff's latest trip to Moscow, right before US promised to impose sanctions on the aggressor state. We're also going to talk about Trump's meeting in Alaska with Russian dictator Putin and what it means for Ukraine. So first, here are the results of Putin-Witkoff meeting in Moscow. Witkoff flew to Moscow last week, and the White House reports that the meeting between Putin and Witkoff went well, and the Russian Federation seeks to continue its interaction with Washington. If everything is so good, then why the sanctions? The question must have arisen for many people who followed the visit of Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff to Moscow, and then Trump's reaction to this visit and other reports on this topic. No specifics from Moscow, Washington. The White House reported that the meeting between Putin and Witkoff went well, and Moscow seeks to continue the interactions with Washington. Trump says that it was a highly productive meeting and that this war must end. And we will work on that in the coming days and weeks. However, the White House also reports that secondary sanctions against Russia are expected to be imposed on Friday. If everything is so good, then why the sanctions? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, after his conversation with Donald Trump, also speaks in hints, although a little more understandable than that we hear from Washington. He said that it seems that Russia is now more inclined to a ceasefire, but added that the main thing is that Russia doesn't deceive us and the Americans in the details. Recently, there have been many publications and statements in the Western media that the Kremlin will not make any concessions, that Putin absolutely doesn't care about all of Trump's threats and ultimatums. And it turns out that he doesn't care at all. And Witkoff was invited to Moscow, and some constructive signals were sent to Washington. And it's obvious that Putin doesn't want to go into confrontation with Donald Trump. On the contrary, he wants to perceive the window of negotiation opportunities in communication with the US president. It was unacceptable for Putin to declare his agreement to fulfill Trump's ultimatum. This would be a sign of weakness, a clear defeat in the confrontation with the US president. The Kremlin needed a counter proposal that were acceptable to Trump and not look like a loss for Russia. What could be the content of the Russian proposals? Most likely, it is about agreeing to negotiations on a phased ceasefire. This could already be a significant step forward compared to Putin's ultimatum position and the categorical refusal of Russian negotiators to discuss a ceasefire without fulfilling the Kremlin's demands. But for now, this is just an assumption, and even the start of negotiations on a phased ceasefire has yet to be agreed upon. And Putin wants to negotiate directly with Trump. But then, a negotiation meeting of three presidents, Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, might be planned. So, the irony of political fate is that in this case, Putin is implementing Zelensky's idea of talks between the three leaders at the highest level. Of course, one should not perceive all this as prologue to the end of the war. On Putin's part, this could be another insidious maneuver from simulating real negotiations to trying to lure Trump into a negotiation trap in order to sell him a softened version of peace on Russian terms, which will then be imposed on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky with a very high probability. Putin will demand significant concessions from Ukraine in exchange for a ceasefire. And since Trump agreed that there would be no Europeans in the negotiations, it is fundamentally important for Ukraine to form a common negotiating position together with Europeans and preferably with the Americans in advance before meeting with dictator Putin. Trump's ultimatum nevertheless worked and became a catalyst for accelerating the negotiations process to end the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but this is only the first glimmer of changeable light at the end of the dangerous negotiation tunnel. This time, however, Trump is ready to join the negotiations, and this, as he stated, would be his last attempt. The head of the White House is connecting heavily artillery, that is himself personally, to the Ukraine Russian settlement negotiations to give a new impetus. I imagine this series of meetings where Donald Trump turns to be a leader of the Russian Federation and Ukraine in turn with the thesis, so you are signing an agreement on a ceasefire and a freeze without limiting the sovereignty and security of Ukraine. Do you not respect me? In fact, back in the spring, advisors told Trump to be careful with direct contacts with Putin, which do not yield any results, because it comes out as a certain reward without reciprocity, which at the same time gives the Russian Federation the impression of coming out of isolation and talking on equal terms. And this is exactly how the Kremlin occupier will probably perceive and sell the meeting if it happens. And the Kremlin will continue to stall, using the very fact of the meetings as a proof of openness to negotiations without any concessions. The only thing that can happen here and now is simply freezing the front line. The logic of meetings and negotiations at the highest level, from Trump's point of view, may be that his presence becomes an additional tool for pressure on the parties and can force them to be more accommodating. Because it is one thing when advisors meet and another thing when it is at the highest level. Especially, the attempt at soft pressure concerns the Russian Federation, which now, based on Donald Trump's rhetoric, is a great obstacle to a settlement. But again, all these meetings do not resolve the key point that the positions of Ukraine and the Russian Federation on the issues of territories, sovereignty, and security of Ukraine are mutually exclusive, and that the only thing that can happen here and now is simply freezing the front line without removing the deep political contradictions, the product of which are hostilities. In reality, we can state that Moscow is once again stalling for time. Washington has never implemented the promised secondary sanctions, apparently deciding to keep this tool as an argument during Trump's upcoming conversation with the Russian dictator. As of now, the situation resembled the Istanbul TV series. Russia continues to feed the international community hints about the possibility of peace, continues to fool Trump. No one knows how long this can last, but definitely until August 15th. August 15th, the date of the meeting of Trump and Putin in Alaska. Another diplomatic reality this time is positive. Ukraine and Europeans have agreed on a common position and readiness to join forces. Our European partners, by the way, are much more consistent and predictable than the United States. So, on the night of August 10, European leaders made a joint statement on peace for Ukraine. Representatives of the European Union are ready to support work on peace both diplomatically and by maintaining significant military and financial assistance to Ukraine. Support for Ukraine should include maintaining existing and introducing new restrictive measures against the Russian Federation. European representatives European representatives are also anonymous. The path to peace in Ukraine cannot be determined without Ukraine. So you will ask what to expect from the meeting of Trump and Putin in Alaska, and possibly Zelensky will join the forces as well. The news that the Putin Trump summit will take place in Alaska has shocked pretty much everyone. This is the most important evidence yet that both leaders want to demonstrate that this will be a meeting of two great powers in the spirit of Yalta, where they can divide the world in their own interests. And Ukraine will be on the menu of his meeting for breakfast, lunch, or maybe dinner. It is striking that Ukraine wasn't even invited to the summit, which will be the center of attention of Ukraine, said well known British economist Timothy Ash. Many will ask why such a sharp U turn by Trump again from threatening 100% sanctions on Russia if the ceasefire deadline is not met by August 8 to completely lifting any tangible sanctions and giving Putin the long awaited summit of major powers that he has been dreaming of for over a decade. For Trump, this is certainly a convenient way to change the agenda and divert public attention from the Epstein case. Otherwise, others will say that all this was the original scenario and that the entire process is now being controlled by the Kremlin and the White House. One thing is clear: Trump has capitulated to Putin's maximalist demands for Ukraine. The leak of the alleged peace terms suggest that Ukraine will have to de facto accept the loss of territories already occupied by Russia, which means the eventual loss of Donbass and Crimea regions. Moreover, in order for Putin to get all of Donbass, Ukraine will be forced to retreat from the territories for which it has fought not for life but for death for the past 3.5 years, shedding blood and spending enormous resources on defense. Russia will receive a complete lifting of sanctions, and with their removal, it will be able to quickly rebuild its military machine for future attacks on Ukraine in Europe. Moscow will presumably also get back all of the frozen central bank reserves, which amount of $330 billion. And here reasonable question arises. Who will they pay the 1 trillion bill to the restoration of Ukraine? Maybe Europe, or maybe no one. As a result, Ukraine will remain weak, destroyed, and unable to defend itself against the next Russian invasion. This is exactly what Putin is seeking. If you remember what happened to Chechnya, he lost his first war, he agreed to back down, and 2 years later, he totally erased the city of Grozny from the earth and took the power in Chechnya. There will be no peace for Ukraine as long as Putin remains in power and has the resources and the ability to interfere in Ukraine affairs. We all know that. He has made it clear that his goal is to complete control over all of Ukraine and they will not accept anything less until he's stopped. Trump, on the other hand, clearly demonstrates his utter lack of understanding of both Putin and Ukraine itself. He simply wants a quick peace that can be passed off as a victory. I don't see reliable security guarantees for Ukraine in the published terms of the peace agreement. There are no explicit promises about future NATO membership, no bilateral security agreement, only vague assurance from the US about possible arms supplies, most likely on a paid basis. But how can the future Ukrainian government believe even a single word from the current US administration? After all, Ukraine remembers very bad experience when it was betrayed, according to the Budapest Memorandum, essentially turned out to be a voluntary give up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees from major powers. Guarantees that were ultimately not even worth the paper they were written on. No Ukrainian leader will be able to agree to even a de facto concessions of territories without concrete security guarantees for those lands that remain under Kiev's control. Security is the key, not only to the survival of the state, but also to successful economic development, as well as to a reliable link to the European accession process. Any such concession without guarantees is a direct risk of a new revolution or even a de, uh, even the defeat within the country. And let's not forget, Ukraine already has the experience of two similar revolutions, the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan. Zelensky understands this very well. The post war period will be a time of recovery and search for answers to complex challenges. Among the key ones are the issues of Ukraine's security and the new geopolitical reality and the new international order. This will be a question not only of preventing new aggression, but also of the state's ability to develop and preserve democratic institutions. Ukraine needs security guarantees that would create the most favorable environment for such tasks. The combination of three components military capability, economic stability, and international agreements is crucially important. European membership, military cooperation, and multi level international cooperation are the basis of security guarantees for Ukraine in a broad sense, as well as the basis for any negotiations on ending the war. In my opinion, many Ukrainians have already concluded after the trap set for Zelensky in the White House early this year, Trump will eventually betray them and hand Ukraine over to Putin. Since then, they have been stalling, preparing for the moment when they will have to walk away from the negotiations and continue the war without US support. They have begun to build their own military industrial complex, increase interaction with Europe, and prepared for the day when America will not just stop supplying them, but will stick a knife in their back. The Alaska summit could be a turning point and more like a Munich, a complete capitulation and surrender of Ukraine, like it was then a Yalta. This week is important for diplomatic work with our partners. The authorities are obliged to ensure the key principle: nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, nothing about Europe without Europe. Therefore, both the UK and therefore both the European Union and the UK should maximally participate in peace negotiations because Ukraine is a decisive part of European security for decades to come. The upcoming meeting in Alaska should not follow Putin's scenario because it will lay such time bombs and will only lead to new mistakes and worse. Now, the Russians will try to fly three planes to Alaska because this is not only legitimizing the murderers, there is also a more pragmatic factors. Visa restrictions will be difficult to roll back later, and having received the dreamed of American visa to enter Putin entourage will, in fact, break this 3 year isolation, return to their real estate, and will be able to visit families who have long lived in the West, which is so hated by the Russian soul, and to end the war. On the contrary, strengthened sanctions should work, not a light regime. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.